changes, 70s to the 90s, part one. So I'm going to be jumping back and forth in a lot of decades here because I wanted to look at some overarching themes of changes that are occurring basically from the 70s through the 90s and even the 2000s to a certain extent. So if you're going to talk about changes in America during the 70s to the 90s, you have to specifically look at the Sunbelt pictured here. We're going to see this becomes one of the most powerful regions within the United States. We're seeing a lot of shifting power into the region, and this region is going to be specifically a region of more conservative voting habits. We get a lot of new factories dotting the landscape here. A lot of times it was smaller towns rather than full-on cities, but you are seeing the growth of a lot of cities in the South and in this Sunbelt region. This is going to be everywhere from like Orlando, Charlotte, Atlanta, Dallas, Phoenix, Houston, and a lot of this comes down to air conditioning really epitomized these booming metropolitan areas. A lot of this also came down to defense spending. So defense spending is really what is going to fuel a lot of the growth of the Sunbelt. You have to keep in mind, going back to like even further, the 50s, you've got like the Korean War, and then now you've got all the way through to the Persian Gulf War. We're seeing the United States make itself be really the mightiest military power globally. And so we get lots of jobs that are being paid for by defense spending. I mean, you got to think about like the aircraft industry, like Lockheed plants, to like specific forts, like with the Air Force Academy up in Colorado. It's pushing a little bit, not quite being in the Sunbelt region, but it's kind of close. You also see that with like defense, that means spending on like American science and technology. Engineers might work on like military projects. A lot of universities were some of the leading defense contractors. And then of course you have your space program, and NASA, Houston, we have a problem and everything, is all justified really by the competition with the Soviet Union. So a lot of this is tied into defense spending. The growth of this region, I should say. Another theme that we see changing during this time period is immigration. So the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 is basically going to transform the ethnic mix of the United States, and it also helps stimulate like that whole Sunbelt region. So keep in mind, the last time we really talked about immigration laws, we were looking at the 20s, and we were looking at the quota systems that were established back in like 1924. And those quotas had like favored immigrants from like Western Europe and really limited those from other parts of the world. There was clearly a racial bias to this old law, but that contradicts America's, self-proclaimed role of being like the defender of freedom in regards to the Cold War. And so this specific act is actually part of a propaganda battle with the Cold War. And the idea is that, America welcomes immigrants from all nations equally. And so it's going to open the doors really up in America. We're going to see, for instance, giving you some specific numbers so you can see the huge difference. Between 1960 and 1964, so before the act goes into place, just in those 4 years, we get about 1.1 million immigrants coming into the United States. Nothing to scoff at, that's pretty good, but there we go. 1990 to 1994, so 30 years later, there's about 4 million immigrants that come into the nation during that 4 years. And it's not even just legal immigrants. We also see an increase in non-legal immigrants as well. In fact, not since World War I had the United States actually absorbed so many new residents. And a lot of this immigration is going to change the nation's ethnic mix. For instance, in 2000, the census, they found that 10.4% of the population had been born in other countries. This is a huge difference compared to in 1970, the census said only 4.7% of the population had been born in other countries. Now, admittedly, if you rewind all the way back to 1910, when we were seeing the huge boom in immigration and everything, the percentage was actually 14.7% of people in the United States had been born in other countries. But you have to keep in mind, too, that not just immigration has increased, but population has increased. So to increase a percentage, you have to increase numbers a whole lot more. When we're looking at immigrants, the largest group is going to come from Mexico due to sharing a border with them. We're going to see a lot of changes made in politics, partly because of these immigrants coming in, and a lot of them were Catholic, for instance, so they bring in a lot of those values to where they're going to vote. We're also going to see, though, immigrants coming across the Pacific. It's going to be, Chinese, Filipinos, Koreans, Samoans, other Asians, and of course Pacific Islanders. We see a lot of Asian immigrants from Indochina after the communist victory back in 1975 there. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, that's going to bring about a lot of immigrants from that area to the United States. When we're looking at this, is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? It is definitely making America more culturally diverse. There are a few negative aspects to this. When you get legal and illegal immigrants coming in, generally that adds to the number of non-union workers just because it takes more time for them a lot of times to feel comfortable joining unions and everything. And so that can be problematic for certain industries or in certain places and everything. But on the positive side, a lot of times immigrants, illegal and legal immigrants, are there's just abundance of opportunities in America during this time period. And so they're going to bring in their talents, they're going to bring in their ambition. And a lot of times this actually helps the expanding economy of the 80s and the 90s, because they're going to open restaurants, they're going to open shops. And a lot of times these might start out as being shops for their own populations, but then would eventually expand to the rest of the population as well. A great actual example of this is Cuban immigrants that came to the United States trying to escape Castro's socialist government, and many of them would stay in South Florida and they'd open their own stores and businesses, and this actually ended up making Miami a major Latino market and attracting millions of Latin American tourists and shoppers, and so that's actually expanding the economy and helping the economy for everyone, so to speak. We're also going to see the theme of America growing older. And I mean, actually, the demographics are becoming older because basically Americans are now being able to expect to survive into older age than previous generations. The thing is, older Americans have always really been a powerful voice in public affairs. Generally, older Americans tend to vote against local taxes, but they're also going to fight efforts to slow the growth of Social Security. You do have to keep in mind when you have more and more Americans becoming older, this can become problematic in that they're being supported in a system that you have a relatively smaller proportion of working men and women to support them with Social Security and everything like that. It's fine as long as population is constantly growing. Fun fact, there are actually more millennials than baby boomers. So as long as it keeps growing in that trend, it works. But if you ever have a smaller population, it becomes a strain on the economy. We are going to see older Americans do get involved in some of these kinds of debates. In fact, protecting Medicare and Social Security became one of the Democrats' best campaign issues come the election of 1996 and 2000s, after basically Republicans suggested cutting some of the spending and growth on those particular items. The old people did not like that, and so then they voted more so for the Democrats in that particular those particular elections and stuff.